Dr. Jeremiah Regan is the Executive Director of Online Learning in Hillsdale Studios for Hillsdale College. He receives his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Hillsdale. Dr. Regan's research focuses on the American founding and early republic, with particular attention on the manly virtues and citizenship in American society. In addition to overseeing the online courses, Dr. Regan directs the Hillsdale College Law Enforcement Outreach and produced the recently released documentary on Colonial America.
Good morning. It's excellent to be here and to participate with you in learning and hearing excellent presentations. Thank you, Ms. Richard. Her talk, along with the others, has caused me to reflect on the genius of our founders in the deep and comprehending and comprehensive view they had on human nature, society, and government, and also my compliments to the organizers of this event who have helped bring to the fore and demonstrate the unity of thought and the clarity of thought of our founding generation. So thank you, Dr. Wheatland and the AV team and the hosting team. This is an exciting time to be in Florida. Your state and New College are doing so much to restore the American spirit and to revitalize American principles, put them into practice in our current setting, in our 250th anniversary of our founding, in fact. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the manly virtues, what Americans said about them, the laws that they passed to cultivate and preserve them, and how they actually lived, given what they said and the laws that they passed. The purpose of this presentation is to examine the ways that early Americans cultivated courage, perseverance, vigilance, when called upon, valor in battle, and other martial virtues through their culture and through their laws. So by way of recap of some of the other presentations we've already heard, I will present the founders' view in summary. The purpose of human life is happiness. For most American founders, this would mean the possession of morality, of complete virtue, so that means the possession of all of the virtues, at least to some extent, piety, proper use of liberty, and sufficient material goods to afford the exercise of liberty. That would put them in the company of many great thinkers, including Aristotle. Virtues such as courage, vigilance, perseverance are necessary for complete character, for full virtue, and therefore they're necessary for happiness. These especially are the virtues that prevent moral compromise. They prevent wilting in the moment of confrontation or challenge, that moment when moral conviction needs to stand firm. And they prevent the failing of the other virtues. They also allow for the things that Ms. Richard just discussed, patriotism. Patriotism requires knowledge in the head and loyalty in the heart, and then it also requires some strength in the arms, because sometimes to defend your liberties, you must fight foreign enemies or domestic criminals. That takes a certain type of virtue that is not merely intellectual. On the intellectual side, these virtues prevent prudence from becoming a euphemism for cowardice, for example. Many times we hear of prudence and think maybe that person is preserving their own interests instead of doing what's right. So on the theme of happiness, in other words, in sum, it's good for men to possess these virtues because men, real men, are sturdy and consistent and brave. Virtues are also important for the society. These virtues help make free society possible. There's the basic sense. The more virtues the people possess, and we heard this in the presentations yesterday, the less vice, the less injury to the rights of others will pervade the society. Virtuous citizens are less likely to injure one another. So you don't need as much enforcement mechanism in the government. Citizens who possess manly virtue are more likely to assert their morality through what Tom West and other scholars call the law of fashion, or basically peer pressure. You won't allow bad things to happen in your society to the extent that you have a say over it. John Adams describes the law of fashion as governing the indecencies of behavior beneath the inspection and censure of law and magistracy, which must be restrained and corrected by satire. In other words, there are plenty of human behaviors that we don't want to pass laws about. We want citizens to say, that doesn't sound right, or you shouldn't say that. I doubt John Adams was envisioning perhaps the modern the modern Harpy memes or the Karen memes. He was talking about serious things like sexual depravity or body humor out in public in front of children. If you go to a sporting event today or a large public gathering, you may encounter that type of thing. We see shirts with descriptions that would have fallen afoul of censorship or blasphemy laws in the past, and people readily wear these out in public. Or they say things that used to appear only in rated R movies. John Adams would say, regular citizens should stand up and say, turn that shirt inside out, or don't talk about those types of things in front of children. That's what we're talking about. Manly virtue enhances federalism. I didn't originally have this point in my presentation, but after this morning, it's necessary because manly virtues provide capacity for citizens to perform duties towards their republic. They allow them to perform or participate in the common defense and in domestic law enforcement, which means the government can perform its duty to protect its citizens while remaining relatively small and inexpensive. A summary of that could be put that Americans in the founding and the early Republican period understood themselves to be the source of government authority, and when they noticed a violation of a duly enacted law which had been passed with their approval by their chosen representatives, they felt it was their duty to express disapproval, and in the case of emergencies or particularly flagrant violations, to intervene. In other words, American citizens felt an obligation to shape and maintain their own society, and these virtues, courage, vigilance, perseverance, are necessary to do that. We should think about this in the historical context. There was no state or federal bureaucracies like what we have today, which pass regulations to govern ordinary life. Instead, we had laws passed through elected representatives. There were also no professional, full-time police or fire departments until at least the 1840s, and then only in the largest cities. Regular citizens were responsible to help put out fires and to help catch criminals and prevent riots. And we'll see that as we describe some of the laws from the early American Republic. Americans delegated these responsibilities far less in the first century of our existence than we do today, and they thought that was proper. The duties of citizens were not limited to the rather passive duties of voting, paying your taxes, and obeying laws. The duties of citizens, in order to properly enjoy the rights of citizens, required some more vigorous work. So we'll take a look briefly at how Americans thought about these based on how they spoke about them, how they sang about them, and how they preached about them from pulpits. We'll start with a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to his nephew, Peter Carr. After providing a list of what anyone would call an excellent classical education, books to read, Thucydides, Xenophon, Plato, Jefferson instructs his nephew, in order to assure a certain progress in this reading, so in order for this classical liberal education to sink in, consider what hours you have free from the school and the exercises of the school. Give about 2 of them every day to exercise. He means physical exercise. For health must not be sacrificed to learning. A strong body makes the mind strong. And then he makes his recommendation as to the type of exercise that his nephew Peter should engage in. I advise the gun. While this gives a moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. Games played with the ball and others of that nature are too violent for the body and stamp no character upon the mind. Draw your own conclusions. Let your gun, therefore, be the constant companion of your walk. So Jefferson's advice to his nephew is read the classics and then take your musket and walk around with it 4 to 6 miles a day. And then you will have boldness, independence of mind, enterprise, and be prepared for happiness and defense of your republic. John Adams, in a letter to his wife Abigail, Dr. Kerwin read the first part of this letter yesterday. I'm pleased to read the second part. The first part is on classical education. What books should our children read? Adams continues, it should be your care, therefore, in mind to elevate the minds of our children, that's the first part of the letter, and exalt their courage, to accelerate and animate their industry and activity, to excite in them a habitual contempt of meanness, abhorrence of injustice and inhumanity, and an ambition to excel in every faculty and virtue. If we suffer their minds to grovel and creep in infancy, they will grovel and creep all their lives. But their bodies must be hardened. So in other words, in order to have their minds exalted, in order to prevent groveling, they must have hard bodies as well as fertile minds. Without strength and activity and vigor of body, their brightest mental excellencies will be eclipsed and obscured. We're not heads on sticks. We need physical as well as intellectual virtues. American society agreed with these leading statesmen. Here is a pop song from the time, known as American Hearts of Oak. Come rouse up, my lads, and join this great cause in defense of your liberty, your property, and laws. 'Tis honor we call you, stand up for your right, and ne'er let our foes say we are put to the flight. This is a pop song about patriotism, requiring courage. How about a hymn? So we just heard a pop song. Let's listen to a sacred song. Who made our soldiers men of might and taught their fingers how to fight and how to aim their shafts aright in the decisive hour. Through him we have trod down our foe, who all around environed us so and sought our fatal overthrow. Bless the delivering power. The hymn uses some phrases from Psalm 144, as you might have picked up. So it's a song exalting these physical virtues, these manly virtues of courage, perseverance, valor on the battlefield. How about a sermon? This is a sermon delivered from the pulpit by Simeon Howard, who is Jonathan Mayhew's successor at West Church in Boston. It is indeed a hard case that those who are happy in the blessings of providence and disposed to live peaceably with all men, so I think that would describe we in this room, it's a hard case that they should be obliged to keep up the idea of blood and slaughter and expend their time and treasure to acquire the arts and instruments of death. He means buying guns and going to training at your own expense so that you can kill your enemies. This is a pastor from a pulpit. Why would we do this? It is a necessity which the depravity of human nature has laid upon every state. We heard about human nature yesterday. We heard that education is a way to raise the excellencies of human nature and diminish the vices of human nature. But the founders were no fools. They knew that sometimes that wasn't enough, and we needed citizens who were courageous and had some martial skill in order to prevent those who will not listen to reason. Jefferson calls them wicked and dissolute men who resign themselves to the dominion of inordinate passions. Frequently we see these injuries, he says. So the depravity of human nature, the existence of wicked and dissolute men injuring the rights of others, takes us back to the reason we need government in the first place, to secure our rights. The purpose of government, indeed, is to protect rights. But the protection of rights, according to early Americans, was not solely the responsibility of government. In other words, citizens did not delegate in its entirety defense of rights to the government. They retained some responsibility. Men are endowed by their Creator with rights, after all. They owe them to God, and therefore have a duty to take it upon themselves to preserve them to the extent that they can. Government is a means of such preservation, but manly personal defense of rights is another. So we've seen in brief how Americans talked about these virtues. Let's see how they put them into practice. And it's important to remember, especially in the early republic, laws that were passed represented the will of the people, I would argue, to a greater extent than they do today. The people's elected representatives are passing the laws the people are asking for the preservation of their own society. So when we listen to these laws, we should see them as obligations citizens are formally putting upon themselves through their elected representatives. The first I'll reference is the militia law, which is actually the second militia law of 1792. This is a uniform militia law, and it's telling that it did not come about under the Articles of Confederation, but under the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation did not give the national government the power to create a uniform law for militia. This 1792 law required all men all free men between the ages of 18 and 45 to enroll in the militia and to acquire for themselves, at their own expense, a musket or rifle, flints to strike the powder, 20 to 24 rounds of ammunition, what we would call today a backpack, a war belt, and a bayonet. This is a full combat load. There's some debate, I don't think in Florida, but elsewhere, about whether the founders intended Americans to possess weapons of war. Were Americans allowed to own weapons of war? Well, yes, they were in fact required to own weapons of war, to buy them at their own expense. In a modern context, we would think of a man going out and buying an AR-15, buying about 10 magazines and enough bullets to fill all of those magazines, having a backpack, body armor, and a belt, probably with a pistol on it. He had to buy this. The law further required that those enrolled in the militia train. They left it to the states to determine the scheduling of the training and the administration of training, though Congress did prescribe the mode, which was Baron von Steuben's infantry manual. But the man had to buy his war equipment and then go train. Almost every state required training 4 times a year. Kentucky, which had a really good militia, trained 5 times a year. In essence, the government is requiring, the national government and the state government in partnership is requiring that all citizens follow Thomas Jefferson's advice to Peter Carr. Get a gun, go walk around in a field with it. That will provide defense for our nation against foreign enemies and domestic criminals, and it will also fortify your spirit, exalt your mind, give you independence and enthusiasm for the country. Washington writes of this law, by giving such a tone to our establishment, he means the militia establishment, by making it universally reputable to bear arms and disgraceful to decline in having a share in the performance of military duties, and fine, by keeping up in peace a well-regulated and disciplined militia, we shall take the fairest and best method to preserve for a long time to come the happiness, dignity, and independence of our country. So this is patriotism in action. The militia, Washington argues, will make people have greater affection for their country, will make them feel a greater tie to their land. They're responsible for shedding blood on its behalf, perhaps. And notice that Washington brings back happiness, the purpose of human life, and the thing which the Declaration of Independence says the government should attempt to preserve the conditions of. Henry Knox, who was Washington's Secretary of War, also the architect of the plan to transport the guns captured at Fort Ticonderoga down to break the siege of Boston early in the Revolutionary War, Henry Knox writes of this militia law, the youth will imbibe a love of their country, reverence and obedience to its laws, courage and elevation of mind, openness and liberality of character, accompanied by a just spirit of honor, in addition to which their bodies will acquire robustness greatly conducive to their personal happiness as well as to the defense of their country. So we're seeing different founders and different statesmen and military leaders in the early republic talking about these things in a very similar way. We need them for personal happiness. We need them to sustain our republic both in the affection of our citizens and in the actual defense of the republic against enemies. And the militia law did not end in defense against foreign enemies or even regionalized riots and tumults, as they were called at the time. If you have men who are trained, equipped, and carrying the expectation that they defend the rights of themselves and their neighbors, you can use them in local law enforcement. Most law enforcement in the early republic was relegated to one full-time elected law enforcement official per county. That would generally be a sheriff. Some municipalities had an undersheriff to go along with them. Some had constables. Coroners sometimes had law enforcement authority. But in general, a county would only have one official law enforcement officer. But there were a bunch of men who were armed and trained who could be called upon to enforce the law in a variety of ways. We call these citizen assistance laws because the citizens assist law enforcement. And remember, these are laws that they asked their representatives to pass. They obligated themselves to participate in the defense of their own rights through the law. Some of them are funny. New Hampshire had a law that allowed the sheriff to require citizens to help him remove illegal fish traps from the river. The sheriff could call upon citizens to remove unruly demonstrators from town meetings, to enforce Sabbath laws, but the rubber hits the road a little bit more in the necessity of physical virtue when we look at putting down riots or the posse comitatus or the hue and cry coming up. So a brief note on some of these. We know what a riot is. The posse comitatus, which is kind of pejorative today, people say, oh, you're going to raise a posse. That was actually a very noble function of citizenship in the early republic. Posse comitatus translates to the strength of the county or the strength of the country. And what it meant is the regular citizens would make sure that the laws that they wanted were being enforced. The sheriff would call upon them, and they would get their kits, which means their weapons and their packs, and they would go stand against the band of robbers or go track down the murderer, assisting the sheriff to do that. Florida, actually, perhaps more than any other state today, looks to that spirit with your many constitutional sheriffs, with your state guard. There's still an idea here, and I think it's an idea on the ascendancy, that citizens have a role to play in preserving the peace and order of their society. Let's look back to the founding era. New Hampshire had a law, for example, that empowered sheriffs and other law enforcement officers to enlist the assistance of citizens in executing their duties. It reads like this: every sheriff, deputy sheriff, or other officer in the execution of his office for the preservation of the peace or for apprehending or securing any person or persons for violating the same or of any other criminal matter or cause, be and hereby are empowered to require suitable aid and assistance in the execution of his said office. So these law enforcement officers were duly appointed to require help from their citizens. Connecticut, similar law. Law enforcement officers were authorized and fully empowered to put forth pursuits or hue and cries. Hue and cries are kind of like the posse comitatus in the moment. The sheriff sees a crime occurring, and instead of raising the posse, he just says, you, and you, come with me, we're going to stop this. So in Connecticut, the sheriff can raise the hue and cry. After murderers, peacebreakers, thieves, robbers, burglarians, great word, and other capital offenders. Should the criminal sought be killed or maimed or hurt while being apprehended, every assistant, justice of the peace, sheriff, deputy sheriff, selectman, or constable, so these are all the formal law enforcement officers, and all and singular persons being aiding and assisting to them, so that's the regular citizens, shall be freed, discharged, and indemnified, as well against the public as against all and every person or persons whatever, from any charge relating to their enforcement action. So this means citizens who participated lawfully in preserving their rights, should they harm, injure, kill, maim the offending party, they were protected from any civil suits or any criminal prosecution. They were therefore encouraged to do the right thing as their sheriff directed them. Massachusetts likewise protected citizens from legal or civil repercussions related to their acts of assistance, declaring that if any such person or persons shall be killed or wounded by reason of his or their resisting the persons endeavored to disperse or seize them, the said justice, sheriff, deputy sheriff, constable, and their assistants shall be indemnified and held guiltless. So it's one thing for a society to say we require you to be courageous, to have perseverance, to have vigilance, and in fact to take up arms against those who are disturbing the peace. And it's another thing to add, we will also ensure that your life isn't ruined through frivolous lawsuits afterwards. It's easy to think about Kyle Rittenhouse, whatever the prudence of his actions were he living in Massachusetts at that time, first of all, the sheriff would have called him, he wouldn't have had to show up on his own. But taking the actions he had taken, he would have been honored rather than prosecuted and sued. Okay, so this does sound like it could be a little bit messy, having minimally trained citizens responsible for the defense of the nation and the preservation of laws. How did these laws work? Not perfectly. In 1844, for example, citizen militia were unable to quell a riot in Philadelphia that resulted in the deaths of dozens of citizens and militiamen. Militia performed poorly outside of Washington in the War of 1812. Famously, the White House was burned by the British. But often these laws worked quite well. The Whiskey Rebellion was put down bloodlessly by citizen militia. Militia performed admirably in Baltimore in 1812. After the British sacked D.C., they wanted to keep their reign of terror going, and they were stopped cold by American militia outside of Baltimore. Militia also performed very well as volunteer soldiers in the Mexican-American War. And many other riots, besides this 1844 riot in Philadelphia I referenced, were put down bloodlessly as citizen to citizen, the wayward thoughts were dispelled. That's the way Henry Lee puts the conclusion of the Whiskey Rebellion. The rebels were educated, the wayward rebels were educated by their brethren without having to use their guns. They were persuaded by their fellow citizens, in fact, to cease their violation of the law. There's other anecdotes, but for the sake of time, I'll skip them, and if anyone's interested to hear them, we can talk about it afterwards. I'll conclude by stating that we should think today, in our changed circumstances, about how we train ourselves and our students to better participate in our society. We should reject the idea that courage, vigilance, perseverance, indeed manliness, are toxic and that they are dangerous. They are dangerous, actually. When they're properly trained, they're dangerous to evil, and they're supportive of good. So as teachers and as parents and as citizens, we should think about ways to cultivate and direct these virtues towards their proper ends as means of preserving our society and leading to the happiness of our citizens. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.